Jesus asked a question, letter A, when Jesus returns, will he find faith? In Luke 18:8, it says it this way, however, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting, maybe just a little side note, but when Jesus was talking, so many times he was talking prophetically. He was talking to his disciples about him going to the cross, his death, his resurrection. Every time he talked about that, he was talking about it prophetically because it hadn't happened yet. He knew it was going to happen, and he knew he was going to be resurrected. Well, he spent so much time as well talking about his return. When the Son of Man comes. Didn't say if, maybe, if it all works out, the Son of Man returns. No, when the Son of Man returns. So many of his parables, he talked about himself in those parables and that the Son was gone for a long time, but he was going to return. Always talking about the idea of his coming back. And so he said, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Precious, precious commodity. It's the thing that changes and transforms everything. Now, there is a general type of faith. Everyone has faith in something, but few people really have faith in God. I had a mechanic years ago. He was a man full of faith and power. He was a strong believer. And the reason I knew, every time I went into his shop, he had this big sign, and it said, "In God we trust." Now, underneath it, he said, "And all others must pay cash." So he didn't have too much faith in me or some of the other customers, but he had a lot of faith in God and a lot of trust in God. And I think about the things that we trust in. Can you imagine? You're up in a plane at 30,000 feet going through all this turbulence, and you realize that this plane was built by the lowest bidder. I mean, you're expecting the wings to fall off or something, but we just get on the plane and we expect that it's going to take off, it's going to land, it's going to do what it's supposed to do, that the pilot, is engaged in gear, and we just assume that it's all going to happen. I hadn't flown much in the last 20 years, and just recently I helped my son Jordan go out to Texas. We drove out there, and so I've taken a flight back. First time before 9/11 is the last time I was on a plane. Before that time, man, things had changed. The rows had gotten shorter. I was on the very back row with my knees to my chest on Spirit Airlines. And, oh, you've been on Spirit Airlines, okay. So we sat on the tarmac for an hour. That was the introduction, and it was hot, and it got hotter as the hour went on. And they were waiting for the pilot to catch a connecting flight from American to come and fly the plane. So, I'm texting my wife. I told her, we're going to be delayed at least an hour. Now, as I was coming in on the third row, well, I guess it wouldn't be first class. I don't think it was first class on Spirit Airlines, but there was a pilot sitting there. And they got the pilot on the third row and had him fly the plane to the next destination. So then I texted my wife. I said, if we crash, I might be a lot later than I expected. But we are expecting that, you get on a plane, you do everything that we do, we just assume that it's going to work out the way. We have faith, in the Depression, when all the banks were closing and there were runs on banks. Well, the government said, hey, listen, we're going to insure every account, FDIC, up to $100,000, so you guys don't have to worry. And the reason people were going and taking their money out was because they had lost faith, they had lost confidence that their money was going to be safe where it is. Well, that is a kind of faith that we take every day. Now, there is another kind of faith that Jesus is talking about, and it's not a faith in man or man's systems, but it is a faith in God, the creator of heaven and earth. Man's faith without God is always temporal. It's always fleeting. It has no faith beyond this life. There's no faith in the eternal. The faith is always insecure because whatever you put your faith in, it's always changing. We put our faith in our career. And if the company that we work for goes bankrupt, if we have our own business, whatever it may be, if things go bad, then, we're out of luck. 2007, Lehman Brothers, one of the strongest institutions in the United States, had been there for over 100 years. It was a foundational block. And overnight, the whole company disappeared. Bad loans, the toxic loans that began the whole domino effect in 2007. And all the people that had their money, that worked there, thousands of employees that had lost everything, it was all wiped away. They would have never imagined, never thought. There was a lady that I had talked to recently. She worked for the airlines, and she had been with the company for 30 years. Started when she was 18. And while she was there, the airlines changed hands 3 times. And she started off 18, married, had a couple kids, and had a great retirement and benefits and everything else. And over the years, as they kept changing hands, she kept losing benefits. She has no retirement now. She has no 401k, all the things. And things go in a temporal fashion. Anything that you're going to put your trust in here on earth, there's no guarantee that it's going to be there tomorrow. And so we cannot put our faith in the temporal things here on earth. Put our faith in relationships, and we know the statistics of things that are happening in relationships. What can you put your faith in that's going to stay? Put your faith in government. Remember, President George H.W. Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And you know how that worked out. And recently, Obama had said, "If you like your doctor," you know where I'm going with that. And so you put your faith in things, whether it's the government, whether it's institutions, whatever it is. If the faith is not in God, it may not last. At what point do we stop trusting in man and put our whole weight and trust in God, who does not change like shifting shadows? He is Christ, the solid rock. The stones, the Bible said, that the builder has rejected has become the cornerstone. Now think about that verse. The stone that the builders have rejected. That's the people of the world. They're building their life, and they come to the stone called Christ in the Bible. I'm not going to use that. And they start building their life on something else. The stones that the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone, the foundation of the life that we, his children, can build our life upon. And he says he will not change like shifting shadows. He is the solid rock. He will not change. Now, our connection to God begins with faith. So what is faith exactly? Let's look at letter B. A good question. Faith is tangible. It has substance. This is how it's defined in Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen. A substance is something that is real, it is tangible, and even though you cannot see it with your physical eyes, it is real. You get 2 magnets, and you put the opposite ends together, and it creates that magnetic field. You try and get them close together, but they won't come together, you can feel that field working. You can't see it, but it's there. You flip it around, and then it comes together like glue, and you can't tear it apart. There are things that you cannot see, but are real. Germs. My wife, every time I walk in the door, I think my hands are clean. No, she knows there are germs on my hands. She makes me go wash my hands, sanitize. Always concerned about the germs that are around. Can't see them, but she can. She knows that they're there, and so she is constantly having me wash my hands. Some people are compulsive. Obsessive compulsive disorder. They got to wash their hands all the time. My wife is that way with me. She made me, OCD. So it's kind of transferable. All right. So faith is something you can see when it's operating in another person. Now think about that. Faith is something you can see when it's operating in another person. In Mark 2:3, this is a story when Jesus said, when he saw their faith. He what? He saw their faith. This is the story about the paralytic and his 4 friends. I'd done a message on this years back. And I think the title of it was The 8-Legged Man, that these 4 friends were carrying this paralytic to Jesus. He was in this house. The house was packed. Went out the door, went all around into the yard and around. There was nowhere for these men to get their friend to Jesus. And back in those days, a lot of the houses had stairways up to the roof, and they were flat. And so they literally took their friend up the staircase, up on the roof, and they began to tear the roof off to get Jesus and to lower him down. Now, I could just imagine the owner of the house looking up and thinking, Martha, what are they doing? They're tearing the roof off, and, they're dropping this guy down. And Jesus said, when he saw their faith, then he healed them. God can see our faith in the actions that we take, in the words that we say and do. Our faith can be tangible. So can unbelief. So can fear as it gets upon us. So we need to build up our faith. Faith is heard in the words that we speak, and so is the unbelief. Now, a few months ago, I talked about the gift of faith. And I had something really interesting. Now, faith can be, let me just say, first of all, everyone can have a measure of faith, saving faith, faith in God. But there is also a gift of faith. Now, just like some people are gifted, have the gift to sing, okay? Now, we can all sing. I can sing. Well, the Bible calls what I do making a joyful noise, yes. And sometimes when my joyful noise gets a little too loud, I've been shushed by my wife. But I'm undeterred. I'll sing even louder because I'm making my joyful noise. But to have the gift of singing is a totally different realm. Well, so it is with the gift of faith. And as I was up in North Carolina, I was visiting my sister Diane and her husband Paul, and they have 2 girls, Leanna and Aubrey, and they had moved up when they were about 9 or 10 years of age. And so I was up there. Now, for Aubrey, I'm talking to her, and I was just absolutely amazed. And for some of you who may remember, Flo shared a testimony. This was maybe a couple of years back. Aubrey has the gift of faith. She and her husband went to Nicaragua a few years ago on a mission trip. She's a nurse. She's got her master's degree, and they wanted to go to Nicaragua. And she said, we prayed about it, and God gave us peace. So they went, and they just took off. They went, and they were there, and they were heading back. And all their people, friends said, you really shouldn't do that. And they're coming back, and they're almost out of Mexico. And the day before, I don't know, she had met this lady, and this lady was just burdened for her, so she gave her this rosary. And she said, okay, so she just put it on her rearview mirror, and they're driving along. Well, they're going, and they got ambushed. There was a banditos, I don't know what they were shooting from like the hilltop. There was a car that stopped in front of them that was blocking their way, and her husband, Matt, he just put it in reverse and floored it and was trying to get out of the way, and they ended up stopping them. And they took Matt out. They started roughing him up. I'm just kind of paraphrasing from what I remember from the story, but these guys had killed people previously in the same situation. And so the head guy goes to the passenger door, pulls out, Aubrey. He's yelling at her about the Americans and things like that. And she's just crying, and she's praying to God. Now, just imagine you've got this beautiful blonde girl here in Mexico, and who knows what's going to happen. And all of a sudden, he sees the rosary, and he stops, and he tells all the guys who's roughing up her husband, Matt, let him go. And they're like, hey, what's going on? Hey, ¿qué pasa? What's happening here? And they just let him go. They drove away. And it was, I believe, maybe God just used, he knew that guy who was going to attack. And maybe he had some Catholic background or something. Something clicked with this guy, and I believe it was an operation of faith that was working that just changed the entire situation, just like you read in the Bible. Well, she's telling me these stories. They had a preemie baby just a couple months ago, 3 pounds, and she's just telling me story after story, and I just trusted God, and I just felt like, and I could just see the operation of faith working in her, and I've never said this to any other person before. I said, you have the gift of faith. And when the gift of faith is working, when faith is working inside of you, you're going to see supernatural things begin to happen and take place. She's at her hospital there in North Carolina, outside of Asheville, and she's working. She works ER, and she's hearing over the microphone, Dr. Graham. She's saying, who's Dr. Graham? Who's Dr. Graham? And there's this old 90-year-old guy with a bunch of, bodyguards around him. He said, who's that? That's Dr. Billy Graham. And so she goes in there, and she's, helping him, working on whatever he was having, and he was so stirred by her, he said, I want you to come to my house and visit. And I should have told her, you have a uncle who's a pastor. Why don't you call him? But when you are walking by faith, expect things to happen that don't normally happen. Expect the power of God to work in that gift of faith that is operating. Well, while we were there, I kind of bring up this story. We had a divine appointment that took place. And the story actually began over 30 years ago in 1982. I grew up with a girl, her name was Regina Harrison. And she was very bright. She had skipped a grade. We're the same age. And so we went to elementary school, middle school, and high school together, but she was a grade ahead, and I almost graduated 2 grades behind. I had to work on a couple of my grades. But anyhow, so we graduate and go to college, and we had a chemistry class together, and she got saved about the same time that I got saved, and she had a very strong faith. There was something dynamic about her walk in her faith, and it just radiated in her life. And you knew that there was something special about this girl. Well, what had happened was that she had gotten attacked. She had gotten raped, and she was left in North Lake, which is a park right by the beach on Sheridan Street. And but before that happened, the Saturday before, she was at the beach with the college and career people from our church, And she was telling somebody, and she had shared this, and the incident happened like the next day or the day after, that she had this heavy burden that something bad was going to happen. But then she said that, you know, God just really ministered to her spirit, and he said, you're going to be okay. And so she just kind of flung it off. She shared that little testimony and went on, and that happened. Well, what happened a few years later after this, my sister Diane and her husband Paul bought the house from the parents of Regina Harrison. They moved off to Tampa, you know, and so they bought the house. They're fixing it up and everything. And their daughter Aubrey, which I guess was about 3 or 4 at the time, was screaming in her bed because she saw like this angel in white and had this auburn red hair flowing down and had a gold chain around her. And of course, my sister and Paul, you know, they're very Southern Baptists. They said, I don't care what you tell us, you're not getting out of bed. And so she wasn't allowed out of bed. And so for some reason, she's telling me this story up in North Carolina, and then her sister Leanna, 20 years has passed, and her sister Leanna said, I saw her too. And they had never shared that before. And if they hadn't have shared that story, I wouldn't have shared the part that I knew, that God was sovereignly protecting her because he knew what was going to happen and take place, and building up her faith. Now, all the details of the story, to be honest with you, you know, sometimes it don't make sense, but I want to tell you that God is at work. He is working behind the scenes. The angels that they saw that day in that house, they may be all around us. We have no idea what God is doing behind the scenes, but we can see by faith, and we can trust by faith that the sovereign God who created the universe is working in our lives, can watch over and protect us and help us in situations that we go through in time of need. Now, I believe that our overall faith is so paltry, so anemic, and I want to tell you, I include myself in that we can hardly relate to genuine, dynamic, biblical faith and expect to see the signs and wonders like they happened in the Bible times. That we are at a place where we need to build up our faith. That's what it says in Jude 1:20. Build yourself up in your most holy faith. When somebody is chronically sick for years and years, you know what happens? They forget what good health feels like. You get into a rut. You get into a funk that you just feel like this is my new normal. This is the way I feel all the time. And all of a sudden, maybe they get healed and they think, wow, I forgot what it was like to feel well again, to feel whole again. I want to tell you, the same is true with our faith. If our faith is not strong, we forget or never knew what real faith can do, how real faith can transform our lives. When we were living up in West Palm Beach, there's a story that really hit home with me. There was a group traveling through from Africa. It was the African Children's Choir, and they were going along raising money for all the orphanages, and all of these kids that were a part of this choir were the rejects. They were the kids in the orphanage, the kids that the parents had abandoned, or maybe the parents had died and they were just left for their own. And this guy had an idea that I'll go through the United States and I'm going to raise money, but the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to train these kids. And these kids were some of the most beautiful kids you'd ever want to see, and they really sang like angels. And these were the rejects, and they danced, they sang, it was unbelievable, these kids. And so we were at Christ Fellowship at the time, and when they would come into a church, they didn't have a place to really house the kids. So what they would do, the pastor would get selected families that he trusted, and he would have 2 or 3 of the kids come and spend the night or the couple days, however long they were at the church, and they were to feed them and to take care of them and get a place for them to sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So me and April were chosen to house some of the kids, and so we're there at this meeting, and I remember the meeting and the guy talking to us, and so we all got these visions. Oh, yeah, we're going to get these kids some new clothes. We're going to take them out to McDonald's. We're going to do all this stuff and toys and da-da-da-da. We're going to really treat these kids and, Disney. And so the first thing he says is, no TV. We don't want any of our kids to watching the stuff that's on the TV. They don't need that. I mean, these kids are already happy and joyful. Don't buy them any clothes. We don't want you to buy our kids any clothes or any toys or anything like that. You see, you give them some toys, and then they're going to start fighting among themselves for the kids who didn't have toys. And he said, and don't take them to McDonald's. Don't feed them any of the junk food. Most of the stuff that you would feed the Americans is unedible for these kids. They have a special diet because they're not used to this. And it's dawning on me that, man, how sick are we spiritually? How sick are we as a people? We don't even know it, because we just consume this stuff every day on the TV. We hear it and we forget. And our faith is so weak that we don't even know what it's like to be healthy. These kids were healthy. They were healthy and strong spiritually. They didn't have the money, but they really didn't need it. We could supply them money, which would bless the other kids back in Africa, but we really needed what they had. We really needed the faith and the presence of God that they had. And most of what we're living in is spiritual junk that just pollutes our body, soul, and spirit. And so I want to talk about the second point, is our soul. How our faith relates to our soul. Our soul is the primary beneficiary of a healthy faith. Think about what Jesus said. He said, "What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet loses or damages his own soul?" And what is your soul? Your soul is your mind, your will, your emotions. It's the person that God has created you to be. And if you go through life with your soul damaged as you go back to heaven. There was a guy, he had a bumper sticker, which I really liked. It said that something like, cars are not the only things that are recalled by its maker. And I thought that was pretty cool, because you know what? Our souls one day is going to be recalled by its maker, God, and we're going to stand before him one day. Well, let's look at letter A. It says, without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he's the rewarder of those who diligently seek him. We got to be people who diligently seek the Lord, that God would reward us. And for most of the world, they're still trying to answer the simple question, does God even exist? There's no saving faith in the fact that they don't even know that God exists, that we go before him and say, oh, I didn't even know that you exist. That's not going to be, is that your final answer? Can you imagine God saying, hey, that's not the solution. That's not a proper answer to God. We, even in the church, I believe that half of us are really fighting that question. Does God really exist? Because if it's not showing in our lives, if it's not being radiated by the way that we live, are we really believing that God exists? Maybe we're just giving lip service to it. And if you want an honest appraisal, if you are saved or not, I think you ought to go and ask your children. See what they say about you. Now, if you don't have children, then ask your dog. You know, your dog's man's best friend, and he'll give you an honest answer. I don't know. But the point is, those who are closest to you know who you really are, know who we are when, you know, we're not here at church, or we're not in the office, we're not out in public place. You know, you may be having this knockout, drag-out war with your husband or your wife or your children, and you're just going at it, and the doorbell rings, and you're like, "Hi, Pastor Dan, so surprised to see you." And in a split second, you're able to become very spiritual. "Hey, didn't expect you to come on in. Why are your kids crying?" "Oh, they're so happy to see you. They're crying," you know. But when you are close to people, they see what's going on inside. You know, I've often said, and it was a revelation to me because I went to seminary and I thought I was this real spiritual guy. And I thought I was spiritual, you know, till I got married. And I thought I was saved till I had children. I thought, oh my gosh. Things were being drug up inside of me that I did not even know was there. Well, God uses that to show us what's really going on in our heart, causing us to be able to see ourselves, as James says, looking at ourselves in the mirror. So what does a healthy soul look like? And a healthy soul, we've been made in the likeness and the image of God. Well, a healthy soul is going to love. And one of the scriptures that I used yesterday at the wedding was, of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And it describes love. And it says that in verse 4, love is patient. Now, why in the world would describing love, would God use patient as the very first adjective? Love is patient. So when I'm impatient, when I'm angry, when other things are going up, I'm not acting and walking in love. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always perseveres. Love never fails. So when these things, as we look at our life, that they're not being manifested in our life, it's just showing us this is what a healthy soul looks like. When it's healthy, it does love. It is patient. It is kind. It's not rude. It's not all of these things. And faith is wrapped in love. What does it say? It always trusts. It has the ability to believe and to trust. Jesus compared a healthy soul or a healthy faith to that of a little child. In Mark 10:15, he said this. He says, "I tell you the truth, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." Can you imagine, as a child is growing up, before it has been corrupted by the world, before it takes the lies and the corruption and the hurt and hardens their heart to the things of God, they are easy to receive, easy to believe, easy to trust other people. And as we get older and we become more and more cynical, and you may have heard the story about the politicians, how do you know if a politician is lying? See if their lips are moving. You know, it's like you don't trust anything that people tell you. We're so cynical because we've been hurt before, we've been lied to before, and we've internalized it. And so we've kind of protected ourselves, and what do? We harden our heart so we're not hurt in the future, and yet our soul gets hurt in the process because we no longer can trust the truth when we see it. We can no longer receive the truth when God is speaking it to us. A healthy soul is being restored back into the likeness in the image of God by faith. That's what God is doing. We're going back. God is renewing our body. He's renewing our mind, our thoughts. We become new creations in Christ. Old things have passed away. All things have become new. And so our life just begins to change, and God is changing us back. And let's look at the last point here that I want to focus on. Faith sees the world differently. If you want to turn over to 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, and I want to look at, let me just start in verse 16 of 2 Corinthians 4. And it says this, "Therefore we do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day." Do you see what he's saying here? He says, we do not lose heart. We're not being discouraged. Even though the outward circumstances that we can see are devastating us, inwardly we're being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. There are people who are walking in the light, and there are those who are walking in the darkness. The Bible says that the God of this age has blinded the mind of unbelievers. They cannot see. They've been born spiritually blind. All of this stuff doesn't make sense to them. But when you're born again, the Bible says that we are the light of the world. The light of Christ is living inside of us. And so now we're able to see, spiritually, we're able to see by the light of Christ. And there is a contrast between those who are walking in the darkness and those who are walking in the light. And it manifests itself. We were up in St. Louis visiting my oldest son, and we were just about 15 or 20 minutes away from Ferguson. And I told my wife, I want to drive through Ferguson before we leave, because I'll probably never pass this way again. And you know what happened in Ferguson with the shooting and all of the riots and Al Sharpton and everything, just burning millions and millions of dollars, property and everything, and the riots in Baltimore and all of the tension that was coming there. And then contrast that, and it was all supposed to be about racial, justice and inequality and everything like that. And it was, anything farther from the truth. But in South Carolina, in that church where 9 black people were killed by a guy who was a white racist, there was a genuine example of the racism that they were looking for, but the political opportunists could not cash in. Al Sharpton comes flying in. But you know what? The people of that church, I don't know anything about them, but they got the love of God. They got the Spirit of God. They've got the presence of God. They did not condemn this white guy that shot them, forgave him, and they diffused all the tension. There were no riots. There were no buildings going up in flame, because those people in that church were walking in the light. They contrast those who walk in the darkness. Those who are walking in the darkness have their own political agenda on the left and on the right. It doesn't matter where it is, but those who are walking in the light are here to honor and glorify God. And when the presence of God is, there is a difference. There is a different world that we see. When you're spiritually blind, you do not see all the good that God has created. And it's there every morning. You can see it in the sunrise. You can see it as you go to the beach and see the oceans. or as we were up in the Carolinas and seeing the beauty of the mountains. All of God's creation speaks of his glory, and you can see the beauty that he has created. In the best situations, the spiritually blind always find flaws. They always find fault. They always find criticism. You walk into this house, and there's this beautiful, beautiful white, spotless white Persian carpet. But there's one little black spot, dark motte, and where do your eyes go to? It always goes to the little flaw that you see. In relationships, do you see the best in your spouse? Or do you see all the flaws and you magnify those? Do you see the best in your children? At work, do you see the best about the job, the fact that you have a job, or whatever it may be? So often that we are just focused on the flaws. We're focused on the judgments and the criticisms. That's not the eyes of faith. That's not what the eyes of faith. We had read it earlier. It believes all things. It trusts all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. Love never fails. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a story about three of the greatest men of the Old Testament. Ezekiel talked about it. Daniel, Noah, and Job. And as he was talking in Ezekiel, God was speaking and saying that even if these men were alive today, they could only save themselves because Israel had become so corrupt. And in the story of Job, we see that his faith operating in the Old Testament. God had blessed him, and one day everything was taken away. His house, his children, all of his money, all of his possessions were taken away in one day. And this was Job's response. It says in verse 20 of Job chapter 1, "At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. May the name of the Lord be praised.' And all this, Job did not sin by charging God with any wrongdoing." Do you see that heart of what? Faith, operating in love. And so Satan comes back and says, "Yeah, but let me make him sick and give him sores and make him look like a leper. Then he's going to curse you to his face." So he does. And in verse 9 of chapter 2, it says, "His wife said to him, 'Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die.' And Job replied, 'You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?' In all this, Job did not sin in what he said." Faith sees the world differently. It operates in the world differently. It acts differently when it's being persecuted, when people are coming against you. It builds up. There's a strength that comes from God, that comes by faith. I want to read one more story, and we're going to close. And the reason Israel could not go into the promised land the first time was because of fear and unbelief that ate away at their faith. That's what happens to your faith. Either you're walking in faith or you're walking in fear and unbelief. And the more that you operate in fear and unbelief, it just eats away at your faith so that you have no faith left to operate in. One of the darkest days in Israel's history happened on a day that was supposed to be one of its greatest and most glorious fulfillments of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. From all the way back in time, from the time that God met with Abraham, and he promised him, "I'm going to give you a land that's flowing with milk and honey, and it's going to be to your descendants." And over 400 years had passed, and the promise had not been fulfilled. Now we get to the very day that this promise is going to be fulfilled. And in Numbers chapter 14, on this day that the fulfillment was going to take place, they sent out these 12 spies to seek out the land, to search it, and to bring back a report. And as they did that, they said, hey, this land is flowing with milk and honey. They brought all this fruit back with them. And they had a bad report, though. They saw the giants in the land. And so 10 of the 12 spies said, hey, we can't go in there. Why? Because they were looking through the eyes of fear. We see giants, we see walls, we see all kinds of obstacles we can never get through. And in verse 4 of chapter 14, it says this, then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid. Fear is going to keep you from being able to walk in faith. That's what happened to the spies. That's what happened to Israel. Because we will, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. Notice what they said. They said, their protection is gone. None of the walls had been destroyed. None of the giants had been defeated. But they said their protection is gone because they saw with the eyes of faith that God was going to deliver them. They had seen miracles in the past, recent past, where they parted the Red Sea just a few months before. They had fed them with manna. They had done all these signs and wonders, the 10 plagues, and they said, we can certainly take the land. And so in verse 20, I'm going to close here. They rebelled, and it goes on to say in verse 18, but the whole assembly talked about stoning them. I want to tell you, when you walk in faith, no matter where you walk in faith, those who do not walk in faith are going to talk about stoning you, are going to talk about making fun of you, are going to talk about belittling you. People who are walking in the darkness cannot relate to those who walk in faith in the light. So this whole assembly got angry. Why? Because Joshua and Caleb wanted to bring him into the promised land. Can you imagine? To bring him into this land flowing with milk and honey. I'm talking to somebody about, going to heaven, spending eternity with God. You get angry with me? Want to take him into the land that God has promised, and you get angry? Why? Because they're walking in spiritual darkness. And so Moses intercedes, and in verse 17, or in verse 20, let me finish here. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you have asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the Lord of glory fills the heavens and the earth, as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth. And let me just stop and say this right now. The glory of the Lord still fills the entire earth. I don't care what you see, his glory is here in the earth. Not one of the men who saw my glory and the miraculous signs I have performed in Egypt, in the desert, but who disobeyed and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their forefathers. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. Contempt that our lack of faith treats God with contempt. We treat God with contempt when we walk in a lack of faith. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit, Caleb and Joshua, and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went in, read that again. I will bring him into the land he went into, and his descendants will inherit it. Think about that. And this is the last thought I want to leave you with. Joshua and Caleb, they were the only two people who went into the promised land, the 12 spies. The other 10 were supernaturally destroyed. Nobody else in Israel of that generation was allowed to enter into the promised land because of their unbelief. But Joshua and Caleb, they saw the land by faith. They believed by faith that God was going to give them that land. And God was not going to take their reward away from them because of the other people's disobedience. This is what I want you to take away with you today, right now. If you walk in the land today, living here on this earth by faith, God will not take it away from us either. If we stand and walk by faith, don't care what the news media says, don't care what the politicians say, don't care what anybody else says, we believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die on the cross for us. We have eternal life, and we are going to walk and live by faith because he lives in our heart. It will never be taken away from us. God blessed Joshua and Caleb, 2 out of almost 3 million people, brought them into the land because they believed by faith. And that is true for us today. Amen? Let's go ahead and stand together. I hope this message has, first of all, encouraged and built up your faith as we begin to walk, because there are so many voices out there that are going to try and discourage, bring doubt, bring disbelief and unbelief. But I want to tell you, our God is an awesome God. He is holy. He is righteous. He loves us. He cares for us. You're here today that your faith would be built up. If you don't know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, the Bible says that today is the day of salvation. If you're going through a struggle in your life and you need prayer, the Spirit of God is here. He hears, He answers, and expect that God is going to hear your cry. So whatever your need might be today, I'm going to ask you to come forward. If you need prayer for whatever it may be,